we are now going to explore some of the main threats to biological diversity on Earth. And at the top, we're going to find that there's going to be a great deal of habitat loss in many places where human populations continue to grow. And often habitat loss is going to be linked to the process of fragmentation. Let's identify these two concepts. Habitat loss simply means that land is clear for agricultural purposes or for urban development. And to give you an idea for how severe this can be, about 98% of the tropical dry forest, which is the main type of habitat in Central America and throughout most of Mexico, though the trees from those forests have been cut down and to a level that forests no longer exist. And in a place that, for me, I always identified as a beautiful, exotic um, rainforest, which is the country of Costa Rica. I was quite shocked when I first flew there, and from the airplane, I was looking at a picture like what you see here in this illustration. This is an aerial view of a region in central Costa Rica. And I was actually imagining that the whole thing was going to be like a jungle with trees and maybe a few rivers cutting through the forest, and that was not the case. As it turns out, in the 1950s, there was a big interest in the production of beef because hamburgers were introduced to the country. And you can go and read about this whole history. Is really interesting, and that's when a lot of the forest disappeared. It is estimated that in the 1970s, only about 21% of the forests remained in Costa Rica. And at the same time, Costa Rica is presented in our study as one of the examples where conservation has had a positive impact, not only in allowing for forests to recover, but also for improving the quality of life of people, of its citizens. And this has been under the effects of conservation. Sometimes people have this idea that conservation has a negative impact on people, and I would strongly argue against that. I would say that conserving biological resources has a tendency to improve not only the lives of a country's citizens, but also the economy of that country, as it happens to be in the case of Costa Rica, a little tiny country in Central America. Now, if you think about deforestation and destruction of habitat as something that is only happening in places away from you, you would be really wrong. In the United States, most of the natural landscape has been altered with the arrival of Europeans and the cultivation of land, which didn't happen before to the extent it happened when Europeans arrived. The clearing of lands for allowing cattle to graze, for the plantation of new crops. Just to give you an idea, there is a piece of information presented in the textbook that explains that in Wisconsin, the prairie habitat was estimated to be about 800,000 hectares. And today there's only about 800 hectares. And so you can see that there's less than 1,000th of the amount of prairie habitat remaining. And most of it has been cleared, as I said before, for agricultural practices, agricultural purposes, the planting of crops from which we obviously depend. Plant diversity in Wisconsin declined by 8 to 60% from 1948 to 1988. And so as you can see, the problem of habitat loss is not one that it happens just in remote parts of this planet. It's happening here in our own country, and it continues to happen at seemingly ever increasing rates. Fragmentation deals with the creation of habitat fragments. And again, I'm going to rely on this picture to show you that there is a patch of forest remaining, and it's going to be surrounded by all of these plots of land where now farming is taking place. And so these habitat fragments can be key to conservation of wildlife, conservation of the flora, the plants in one place. And we will be talking a little more about landscape conservation. So the creation of fragments by themselves is not something that is desirable, but it is something that we can use to the advantage of preserving biodiversity. Another problem with another threat to the biological diversity is going to be the introduction of invasive alien species. Sometimes we describe them as exotic species because they came from a different place and now they're introduced into a different geographic location. And this happens either by accident or sometimes even intentionally. By accident, that is how rats, for example, have been introduced to islands where rats didn't exist before. And rats can be a serious problem because they may have no natural enemies. That's what happened in Galapagos with a lot of the birds in those islands. Rats did not exist there. And because many birds in Galapagos actually nest on the rocks of those islands, for the most part, are going to be deserted, the presence of rats can have a devastating effect. I remember also visiting the islands in the Sea of Cortez, the Gulf of California, and in those places, you are restricted from arriving with anything in your possession because of that prevention of the risk of bringing rodents into the islands. Here in this illustration, you can see the brown tree snake, which was introduced in Guam, an island with a lot of different endemic, by endemic, I mean species that are only found in one place. And I want to talk about bird species, lizard species. And this snake was introduced by accident. It wasn't purposefully. And as a consequence from the introduction of this snake, uh, 12 bird species have gone extinct and 6 lizard species have disappeared. There are efforts in the island to eradicate this animal, but it is going to be one that will be very, very difficult to completely remove, to eradicate, because of precisely the lifestyle of the animal. It lives in the trees, and so they are real difficult to find sometimes. So the problem with introduced species, with alien species, is that often they're going to be spreading out of control. They have this invasive nature to them, and that is because they have no natural enemies in the places where they're going to be introduced. This week's discussion is going to be dealing with the effects of invasive exotic species, and I hope that you learn more about this topic when you are completing your discussion. Another problem we have, another threat we have to the biodiversity is going to be overharvesting. And overharvesting means that you are extracting species from the environment at a rate that doesn't allow those organisms to rebound, to recover. Overharvesting can be done with plants, with trees. Overharvesting can be done to animals. And it is a real threat because, as we're about to describe, when the numbers of individuals in a species or within a population gets to a low level, they can get to a small number from which, even when the species is still there present, they will not be able to recover. They're going to be doomed to extinction. And so when you think about species that live in islands, where there is little chance of naturally having new individuals coming and recolonizing the place, overharvesting can be a problem. The oceans, although they are vast and they cover the greatest proportion of the surface of this planet, the oceans sadly are being also overharvested. And the example you see here is the example of the bluefin tuna. In the early 20th century, there was really no interest commercially on this fish. It was being used in the production of cat food, if you would imagine. And then people discovered that it's actually the meat from bluefin tuna is actually good. It's delicious. And when consumed in the form of sushi, it can be a delicacy. It can be something that can be expensive at the same time. And so when the sushi industry in Asia, particularly in Japan, but around the world, began to demand more of this fish, more of the bluefin tuna, the harvesting levels increased, and it is estimated that the population of bluefin tuna has declined by over 80% And not only are the number of fish less in the ocean, but the size of the fish is smaller. And this is a problem for fish because fish really never stop growing in life. And so a larger female, which is going to be an older female, has a greater reproductive potential. But if all the large females have been already been extracted, fished out of the ocean, and we only have smaller females living in the oceans, their reproductive potential is smaller. And this is not going to allow for those species to reproduce at a rate that will allow for the levels of harvesting we are doing right now. That's the problem with overharvesting. Another threat we can recognize is going to be global change. And when I was a young person in school, like you are now, the number one threat at a global scale we talked about was acid precipitation, acid rain. Well, the threat hasn't gone away, it's still there. Acid rain can be a serious problem, not only for organisms that live uh, on the continental portion of Earth, but also those that live in aquatic environments like lakes and ponds, because the pH of rain can be as little as 5.2, and that is indeed a pretty acidic level. When people are exposed to acid rain, it can lead to ulcers and damaged lesions to the skin. I imagine what that can do to plants, but particularly phytoplankton, the algae type of microscopic organisms that live in the ocean. They're going to be more susceptible to these changes in pH. And so one of the questions people ask is, why do we have acid rain? As it turns out, acids can form in the clouds when the exhaust from factories and the burning of fossil fuels, which contain sulfur compounds and also nitrogen compounds, when those combine with water, they end up producing sulfuric acid and nitric acid. And so that's what drives the pH to just above 5. And we can do a lot of this prevention of acid precipitation by limiting the number of emissions. And many countries are taking action in reducing the number of emissions coming from factories, from the manufacture of goods. But there's still a lot that needs to be done, and acid precipitation has not gone away. It's still taking place, but now it's probably being pushed to the sides in the headlines by other concerns we have, such as the greenhouse effect and the global change at the level of increased temperatures in throughout the world. So obviously we need to do something. And one of the things that we need to do is we need to conserve populations. We need to prevent populations from getting too small, because when a population gets too small, it means that there is a greater chance that those breeding individuals that still remain are going to have a great degree of relatedness. By relatedness, I mean that if you're looking at animals, there's going to be inbreeding. There's going to be breeding between relatives. And so the problem with inbreeding is that it's going to lead to a series of problems that I am about to describe. One of the problems we see with inbreeding is going to be an increase in the rates of birth defects among the members of the population. It has been studied in certain populations of lions in Africa that, because of the changes in the use of land, have led to very small populations of lions. Males end up producing sperm cells that are defective. They are not motile, and so they don't achieve the purpose of fertilization that is needed for sexual reproduction in animals. Also, the offspring are born weaker. They don't survive sometimes to our reproductive age. And all of these problems are going to be the consequences of inbreeding. Small populations, as you've learned, are also susceptible to genetic drift. a catastrophe may happen, something, an unforeseeable weather phenomenon can take place, like a fire, a drought, and these things can wipe out smaller populations much more easily than if you have a healthy number of individuals in a population. And so, what we have with small populations is what we call the extinction vortex. If a population gets to be so small, inbreeding takes place, genetic drift happens. Now you have a loss of genetic variation. And as you know, a population that doesn't have genetic variation built into the alleles that are part of the gene pool is going to have a lesser chance of surviving when the environment changes. There's lower individual fitness, populations adapt less likely to environmental changes. This leads to lower reproductive rates, as I mentioned before, like in the case of inbreeding depression, and also lower reproduction rates, have higher mortality, and this leaves the population even smaller than we began with. And so conserving populations, maintaining them at an adequate size must be a priority in when it comes down to conserving biodiversity. So scientists have estimated that there's going to be, for all living things, a minimum viable population. That is going to be the smallest number of individuals that are needed to sustain the species and sustain the population in the places where they live. Now, to do this minimum viable population, scientists can actually look at a number of factors, including um, how many individuals are likely to die because of storms, because of predation, because of some natural catastrophes that are likely to happen in a place where a population lives. And so when you take all of that into account, just random mortalities, then and the quality of the habitat, the place where the population lives, then you can come up with this minimum viable population. One example that is described in our reading is going to be that one of the greater prairie chicken. And so here you see this animal and how in the 1970s it began to decline because of overconsumption, and the population went down to uh, below 50 uh, breeding males. In the 1980s and the 1990s, it was decided that the few remaining individuals were doomed to extinction until new individuals were introduced to this population. And after the translocation, the movement of new members for this population, the population rebounded and is now able to survive. So keeping the right number of individuals, an adequate number of individuals, at least the minimum necessary for survival, can be an effective strategy to prevent some populations from going into extinction. There's also what we call an effective population size. Let's not talk about the minimum size of a population, but something that is effective, something that is going to be a little more hardy in terms of toughness to survive environmental changes or the spread of diseases. This effective population size is going to take into account uh, the minimum viable population number, and it is going to basically, as I said before, take into account the available space, the available area, and what we look at here is the probability that the population will survive to 100 years, to 200 years, and estimating those numbers, as I said before, requires a lot of different factors. It can be done, but it's more details than we have time to explore here in this presentation. In a study done at the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, it is was estimated in 1978 that a population of 70 to 90 grizzly bears had a 95% chance of surviving to 100 years. And so somebody may say, hey, that's good, right? But then what happens after 100 years? Then it was also estimated through this analysis that a population of 100 bears had a 90% chance of surviving to 200 years. So you can see how adding a few more individuals can significantly increase the outlook, the survival outlook for a population. It is estimated that currently there are about 700 grizzly bears just in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, which, by the way, includes states of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. That's where this area we're talking about is located. And it is estimated that this effective population size is about 175 grizzly bears. And that means that overall for the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, grizzly bears are they have a healthy population number. And we don't have too much of a concern in terms of the survival for this species, at least in the short term. Preserving critical habitat is also going to be important. The loss of critical habitat can threaten species, and all plants and animals have qualities to the habitat they need in order to survive. The example I have here is the red cockaded woodpecker, which requires forests with pine trees and they need to have low undergrowth vegetation. The undergrowth vegetation is something that can be kept low by allowing fires to routinely burn through the forest. When fires are burning routinely through the forest, it keeps down all of that vegetation. It prevents the accumulation of all the kindling, all the dead leaves and branches that if you would allowing those to accumulate, when a fire comes, the fires burn too hot, and all that undergrowth vegetation and all that kindling allows for the flames to reach higher and destroy the trees. That's the problem with the forest you see down here compared to the one above. The one above is a healthy forest. This one here is not as healthy because imagine the fire coming, the flames going up, it eventually reaches the canopy of the mature trees and the forest is burned down. Now, the red cockaded woodpecker needs the habitat with the low undergrowth because they need to have a clear area for flying from tree to tree and also from the places where they are gathering food over to the places where they are nesting. Additionally, they need live trees because unlike other woodpeckers which make their holes on dead trees, the red cockaded woodpecker uses the resin of a live pine tree to flow down. They drill little holes for the resin to run down, little holes just below the nest, and that resin discourages other predators from climbing up the tree and threatening the nests or the chicks when these animals are nesting. One of those possible threats can be corn snakes, which have a tendency to feed on the eggs and the young of other birds that are nesting. So this is an example of a critical habitat for the red cockaded woodpecker. You need to have forests with low undergrowth vegetation, not too much obstacles in terms of allowing the animals to fly, and live trees.